Hi everyone, my name is Malvika and I'm a research assistant at the Child Cognition Lab, where I did my Keystone project on science identity. Through this project, I wanted to look at the way that people define science influences their science identity. And another aspect that I wanted to explore was the role of gender. So is this different between men and women? And the reason why I was drawn to this project is because growing up, I didn't have a strong sense of science identity. So like a lack of sense of belonging, a lacking like sense of capability. And so I wanted to explore whether that was an influence of my gender or other factors, for example, the way that I define science. And so an important aspect of science is the way that we align ourselves with science or see ourselves within it. And this is known as our science identity. And understanding science identity is important because it has early and significant impacts. So for example, research has found that science identity can influence your current educational choices, like students' current educational choices, but also the paths that they pursue in the future. And in developmental psychology, it has been found that parents may use different language and have different beliefs towards their child's ability of science based on their gender, and this may be another reason why men and women develop different science identities. And then looking at the relationship between science identity and gender, so research has found that it firstly plays a greater role in shaping participation in science for girls than it does for boys. And then as one can assume, stereotypes also have a role to play in this. And so, for example, the endorsement of gender interest stereotypes can result in a decrease in STEM, particularly for girls. And then why am I investigating science definitions? So previous research has looked at scientific knowledge, nature of science, the way that people understand science, but very little work has simply asked participants or people, what is science, or what does it mean to do science? And so given that the way that we think about science, that the way that people talk to us about science, and other social factors such as gender, personality can influence science identity, maybe the way that we conceptualize or define science can as well. So the first set of research questions looks at that. Does the way that somebody defines science predict their science identity? I will be referring to this as self-science identity. And then the second, does the way that somebody defines science predict the way that others around them see them as part of science? And I'll be referring to this as other science identity. The next set of research questions looks at the relationship or the influence of gender on the relationships. So first is the relationship between people's definition of science and self-science identity, different from men and women. And then second is the relationship between people's definitions of science and their other science identity, different from men and women. So participants in this study were given a survey on a platform called Prolific. There were 255 American adults recruited, and as you can see, there was about an even split of gender, so between men and women. And the survey composed of 3 components. The first was the definition of science phase. These were a combination of open-ended or closed-ended questions, such as what does it mean to do science? Second, the science identity phase. These were a series of rating scale questions, and then a follow-up asking participants to explain their rating. And then lastly, the demographic phase, so looking at age, gender, race, occupation. And then 2 questions that we extrapolated data from was for the science identity phase. The first one was a self-science identity rating, so I am a person who enjoys doing science. And then the second statement said, people I know see me as a person who enjoys doing science. And then participants were asked to rate this on a 4-point scale that you can see here. And then for the definition of science phase, we asked participants simply, what does it mean to do science? And so I want you all to take a minute here and think about what does it mean to do science to you? And so you might be thinking of the scientific method. You might be thinking of testing, designing an experiment. You may be thinking of scientific topics, chemistry, biology, physics. And so based on such responses, we created 4 categories or codes that we use to code participants' responses. And if their response met the criteria of more than one code, they were given more than one code. And so the first one is a process-oriented definition. So this is a process of learning or investigation, such as hypothesis, testing, experimentation. A subject-oriented definition was one that looked at different scientific topics or non-scientific, so plants, animals, world. And then an empirical-oriented definition looked at data, evidence, results. And then lastly, the getting new information definition was sort of to serve the purpose of furthering knowledge. And then any definition that didn't fit the criteria of any of those 4 codes or involved irrelevant information was deemed uncodable. So for example, go to school, read books, and be fooled into thinking you learned something. And so what did we find? We found that on average, men and women have similar self-science identities, as you can see to the left. And then to the right, you can see that there was a larger difference between men and women's other science identity. So with women less likely to perceive that others around them think of them as belonging in science. And then this is the breakdown of the kind of definitions that we received. So most participants gave process-oriented definitions, then subject, then getting new information, and then lastly, empirical. We found that personal science definitions do not predict self-science identity. We found that personal science definitions do not predict other science identity. And then there was also no effect of gender on the relationship between science definitions and self-science identity. However, there was an effect of gender on the relationship of science definition and other science identity. So what does this mean? Let's explore this further. So we found that for women, the tendency to give process-oriented definitions attributed to a lower, or was associated with lower other science identity. So the belief that others around them perceive them to be as someone who enjoys doing science, as you can see across the orange line over there. And for men, that relationship was the opposite. So men with process-oriented definitions were more likely to think or have higher other science identity ratings. And as you may recall from a couple slides ago, men and women are equally likely to give process-oriented definitions. And then men who define science as a subject-oriented process had lower science identity ratings, as you can see across the blue line. But for women, there was no significant change based on subject-oriented definitions. And so, as I said, for both genders, while other science identity is affected by the kinds of personal definitions that people hold. And while both results are equally interesting, I want to explore the finding that women with process-oriented definitions are less likely to have have lower science identity, other science identity. And so it is interesting that while women are giving very scientific-like explanations, so for example, the scientist's definition of science, as you can see, is a process-oriented definition, i.e. a systematic methodology, they're still less likely to think others perceive them as someone who enjoys doing science or belongs in science. And one way to interpret this is because maybe if they don't believe that they are involving themselves or participating in science in a process-oriented way or one that aligns with their definition, they're less likely to think that others around them perceive them to be as someone who's part of science. And this has important implications as it can help, or it can suggest that may be why there's a lack of pursuit or a lack of participation of women in science. And so then how can we further explore this? So for example, one way that we've already started looking at it is how broad are people's definitions of science, so the categorization of traditional versus non-traditional science activities as being scientific. And preliminary analysis, has found that the categorization of traditional versus non-traditional science does have an impact on science identity. And then the second thing that we've already started looking at the Child Cognition Lab is researching on children. And this is important to try and understand how early this relationship between personal definitions of science and science identity occurs, and creating interventions to create more equitable science identities. Thank you, and a very special shout out to the Child Cognition Lab. I'll be taking questions now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We'll have a brief question and answer period if anyone has any questions.
Hi, can you say more about traditional versus non-traditional and what you mean by that?
Yeah, of course. So I can go back. So traditional science activities are ones that you'd think involve scientific subjects like chemistry, biology, physics, and then non-traditional science is something relating to psychology, for example. So why babies cry. And we found that the way that when people say, yes, this is science and this is a traditional science activity, that has an influence on their self and other science identity ratings. But it's all preliminary research. We're still exploring it further.
Fantastic presentation. There was a word in my mind that you never said, I think, and that was scientist. Instead, you were saying doing science or belonging in science. And I'm really interested in why you didn't ask if people were scientists or not.
So actually, the survey did have a question: what you think, or how would you categorize a scientist, or explain what a scientist is? But we didn't have the time to code that for this presentation. But the language that we use for doing science is because we found that like previous research has found that women are less or more. I'm trying to find the word. They're like more. They find it easier to answer responses that don't talk about innate ability and talks about something that's sort of like working towards something. So hence that wording. But yes, we did ask about scientists as well.
Any other questions?
I'm wondering what kind of child research you are actually doing at this point.
Just in general, or?
With respect to this question.
With respect to this question. So the research is actually, it's a very similar survey protocol, except it's being done in an interview format, and it's being done at the Museum of Science, and children are being asked very similar questions, and that is what kind of inspired this. Like, hopefully the goal is to be able to see kind of like the trajectory over age as to how science identity, like, or that relationship between science identity and definitions of science kind of carries over the different ages. So starting as young as 5 years old, and then all the way up to, as you saw, we had an entire age range for adults.
We have time for one final question if there is one. Fantastic.
Thank you so much. This is incredible. Can you talk a little bit more about what type of interventions can be possible, and would they be different based on gender, and just if you have anything in mind?
Yeah, something that we are also looking at the Child Cognition Lab is looking at like scientific curriculums and trying to understand like children's scientific understanding. So I would think that an intervention that related to science definitions and science identity would simply look at trying to understand how kids define science early on, and trying to create more positive language in classrooms that sort of pushes them to be like, okay, how do I define science? Am I involving myself in science in that way? Are people around me thinking? And kind of just having those conversations as early on as possible. But never know what research shows later.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for that incredible presentation.